Okay, so this is the issues with Aristotelian virtue ethics, pages 336 to 347. Okay, so we'll start off with issue 1. Can Aristotelian virtue ethics give us sufficiently clear guidance about how to act? So this problem is the idea that while other moral theories such as utilitarianism and Kant's ethics give us a clear guidance and rules which we are to follow, Aristotelian virtue ethics might not. So it's vague. That's what I'm trying to say. At first it might seem like Aristotle gives us clear guidance about how to act, which is act moderately in any situation. Yes. So, but we know that Aristotle did not take this mean to be a moderation. In other words, there shouldn't be a clear rule that everyone follows. And then we move to the explanation. So we can understand why Aristotle doesn't give us clear rules to follow. If we look at his doctrine of the mean, it tells us that we should act differently in certain situations. So there's never one correct way of acting in every situation. So for example, if we look at other moral theories such as utilitarianism, it's always correct to maximize happiness and avoid pain, right? With the doctrine of the mean, a virtuous action is a mean between an excessive and a deficient response. But we may sometimes have to act in an extreme way, for example being furious at the unethical behavior of a large corporation. So what this is saying is that sometimes things such as vices such as lying, stealing, which are usually considered extreme or deficient virtues, are okay and can be virtuous actions. And then the example of being angry at the unethical behavior of a large corporation. So the problem is, how do we know what the right action is? Is it possible to know what the virtuous action is in any given situation? The problem with the theory is that it's vague and it's not clear. It doesn't give us a proper guidance on how to act in every single situation. Then the response is that, well, can it be that Aristotle does provide us with a clear enough rules to follow? So Hertzhaus believes that Aristotle does offer us a guidance on how to act. Aristotle gives us a clear virtues that we should strive for and clear vices we should avoid. If we take this into account, we are provided with rules and principles which we are to follow. Hertzhaus calls them the V-rules. So for example, the virtue of truthfulness entails the V-rule, do what's honest, while the vice of meanness entails the V-rule, do not do what is uncharitable. So we do in fact have rules that which we are to follow and things we need to avoid. So that's what she's trying to say here. So we move on to issue 2, which is, can Aristotle's virtue ethics deal with clashing or competing virtues? So a moral theory can be tested by applying it to a moral dilemma in which there isn't a clear answer. If you can find a moral dilemma that works, it shows a weakness of that moral theory. So for example, if we use Kantian ethics, it would be the axe murderer and lying to him, right? That's the moral dilemma. Saving a person by lying to someone, which breaks the rule of not lying. Yes? So in the case of virtue ethics, nearly every situation which you have to make a moral decision will become a dilemma. This is because there are usually more than one virtues that you have to follow and vices you have to avoid. Only with experience will you be able to live your life only making the best moral decisions. So an example where virtue ethics does work will be, one day your friend lends you an axe. He comes back the following day asking for the axe back in a manner that makes it seem like he wants to kill someone. So is the right thing to do give the axe back, or to lie and say that you lost it? So let's discuss this. On one hand, you don't want to lie, and therefore you're trying to avoid the vice of not lying. On the other hand, you don't want to allow your friend to kill someone. Aristotle believes that the right thing to do is to lie, in order to save a life here. It might seem like there's a conflict of virtues of being truthful and kind. So being truthful is lying to someone, so being virtuous. Or on the other hand, you're not kind by allowing your friend to kill someone. But there isn't. This is because sometimes the mean can itself be an extreme. So a deficiency of honesty in this case would be what a virtuous person would do. So this is saying that sometimes the virtuous thing to do can be an extreme or deficient thing to do, right? A moral dilemma, which could be applied to virtue ethics, is let's say that there's a couple who both love to play the piano. One day, the wife gets into an accident which leaves her unable to play the piano, and she asks her husband to kill her as she no longer wants to live. It's a depressing life at that point. Later, the wife gets into a second accident where she's left paralyzed with dementia. So she can't remind her husband that she doesn't want to live anymore, and she can't speak either. So the husband decides to kill his wife by suffocating her with a pillow. So was this a right thing to do? Was it a virtuous thing to do? On one hand, the husband displays the charitable virtue by acting on his wife's wishes. So the wife wishes to die, and the husband delivers by killing her, right? But also the virtue of justice, which would prevent us from killing anyone. So even though he acts on the virtue of charity by killing his wife, he also kills someone, which means that he commits the vice of killing someone and not acting on the virtue of justice. There's one hierarchy of virtues, but if there's no hierarchy of virtues. But if Aristotle was to have one, he would put the justice virtue above charity. This is because he himself admits that some virtues might be an extreme, for example lying to your friend to save her life. So some extreme or deficient actions can be virtuous. But some actions are just always immoral, such as killing, stealing, and others. If this is to be followed, then this is the moral dilemma for Aristotelian virtue ethics. Then the issue 3 is the possibility of circularity in defining virtuous acts and virtuous persons in terms of each other. So the explanation is what is a virtuous act? So Aristotle would answer this question by pointing to the virtuous people. Virtuous actions are those done by virtuous people. The virtuous people are the role models we look up to. This is quite simple. But then, who are the virtuous people? If the answer to this are people who are who act virtuously, then the problem of circularity arises. So this is saying that how do we know what a virtuous act is? Well, a virtuous act is done by a virtuous person. But who is a virtuous person? A person who acts virtuously, and then there's a circularity there. So you define one by defining the other. Okay. So Aristotle tells us that for a human to be virtuous, he needs to reach eudaimonia. So this is defining a virtuous person in terms of eudaimonia. But you also can't do that, because in order to reach eudaimonia, you need to be a virtuous person, which leads us back into the problem of circularity. For example, you can define a virtuous person to be someone who reached eudaimonia. But in order to reach eudaimonia, you need to be a virtuous person, and then you need to act virtuously, and to act virtuously, you need to be a virtuous person. So that's the issue, right? So then we move on to issue 3, which is must a trait contribute to eudaimonia in order to be a virtue? So in order for you to reach eudaimonia, you have to act virtuously. In order to flourish, we must excel, be virtuous in our function, which is to reason as human beings. But is it possible for us to come up with traits that might be virtuous but don't contribute to eudaimonia? So Aristotle believed that extreme and deficient actions, in other words, vices such as killing and stealing, do not contribute to eudaimonia. But Aristotle understands that on occasion these actions are the right responses. This, however, doesn't mean that these actions become character traits, as they only happen on occasion. For an action to become a character trait, it needs to happen during a long time period, over and over again. So let's bring up the example of a war. So let's say that during war that lasted 4 years, you were consistently acting in an extreme and deficient way. For example, stealing, lying, and killing people. But these things may be the right thing to do, because the people you're lying to are vicious and corrupt group who are harming your well-being. So this example shows us how a negative trait, which becomes a trait after years of practicing these actions during war, can become virtuous, even though they don't contribute to eudaimonia. So let's put this into an argument. So premise 1 is that a virtue, according to Aristotle, is a disposition to act towards the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, in the right way. This is called the right 5, also known as the R5. So premise 2 is that on occasion, acts such as stealing, lying, and others may be considered the right 5, such as war, where you kill and steal. So if these unique circumstances are repeated over a long period of time, which we go back to the example of war that lasted 4 years, a disposition may be developed for stealing and it still be considered the right 5, which makes it virtuous. Then premise 4 is that traits like stealing, lying, cheating do not contribute to eudaimonia. And we can conclude that there are traits which are still virtuous that don't contribute to eudaimonia. Right? And then a response to this is that Aristotle may attack the premise 2, because in his book 2 of the Ethics, he writes that some actions, such as murder and theft, can never be the right response. So even during war, killing someone or stealing is not the right thing to do, even though it might seem like the virtuous thing to do. But let's say, for the sake of the example, that Aristotle agrees the premise 2, and stealing and killing in that circumstance is actually acceptable. Then would it mean that the traits developed during war demonstrate virtue, because in this context they're the right thing to do? So the answer is no. Aristotle may attack the argument at another point, the premise 4. The actions taken at war do in fact contribute to eudaimonia, as they allow you to survive. So these actions allow us to act virtuously for the rest of our lives after war. So we can now reject. Okay, so let me explain. So, yes, in fact, killing and stealing in this case does contribute to eudaimonia, in the sense that these actions allow you to survive, and after war you can become a virtuous person to reach eudaimonia. Without these actions you would die, and therefore you can't reach eudaimonia. So we can reject the conclusion and conclude that a trait must contribute to eudaimonia in order to be virtuous. So we move on to issue 5, the relationship between the good and the individual. The relationship between the good for the individual and the moral good. So Aristotelian virtue ethics are quite different to modern moral ethics, such as utilitarianism and Kant. This is because virtue ethics focus on personal character traits and the personal happiness. So in issue 5 we're going to answer and discuss 3 questions. What is meant by the good for the individual and the moral good, and how are they different? And the question 2 is Aristotle's virtue ethics focuses only on the good for the individual, and why should we support this view? So why should we support focusing on only yourself and not others? And if Aristotle's ethics are focused on the good for the individual, then what way can be reconciled with the moral good? So let's answer the first question of what is meant by the good for the individual and moral good, and how they're different. So in modern philosophy there is a clear distinction between actions that are self-interested. These are the actions done for the personal benefit, right? And actions which are done for the benefit of others, such as Kantian ethics. Most modern moral theories agree that moral good often lies within the good of all. So to be moral, you have to contribute to the good of all. This idea came from Western teachings on morality over the past few hundred years, which was heavily influenced by Christian teachings. So then we move on to question 2. Does Aristotle's virtue ethics focus only on the good of the individual, and why should we support this view? Okay, so Aristotle's virtue ethics are widely acceptable to be self-centered. Even though Aristotle talks about the good, he does it without mentioning helping others. For example, Bertrand Russell talks about how the character traits that Aristotle admires are the traits you can often find in the type of person who's only looking after himself. Overall, virtue ethics show us how we can individually reach eudaimonia. Aristotle guides us towards our own happiness, disregarding the happiness of others. Aristotle sees virtues as valuable because they help us to reach our own happiness. So the only reason that you should be a virtuous person is to reach eudaimonia, which benefits only yourself. But let's answer the question 3, which kind of responds to question 2. Is Aristotle's ethics, if Aristotle's ethics are focused on the good for the individual, then what can be reconciled with the moral good? What way can be reconciled with the moral good, yes? So Aristotle critiques a lot of the ends and goals that people strive for, such as pleasure and wealth, and others, that appear to be for ourselves, right? He believes that we can be wrong about these ends and about what we should strive for. So this is basically saying that a lot of the end goals and ends we have for ourselves, such as pleasure and wealth, we shouldn't actually aim for, and Aristotle doesn't agree with that. So Aristotle's account of virtues does not mean that pursuing virtue is incompatible with the moral good. If we think about the virtues that Aristotle wants us to develop, we realize that many of them actually do hold a moral value for the rest of the society. A person who is virtuous and lives a virtuous lifestyle is not only contributing to himself and the happiness of himself, but also for the happiness of others. And let's use an example of some virtues, such as kindness, bravery, and charity, that are all aimed at the moral good of all, at the same time as being self-centered, in the sense that if you do follow these virtues and you do become a virtuous person, not only is it good for the society, it's also good for you, as you reach eudaimonia, you reach happiness, you reach the end. That's what Aristotle responds with, and that's the end.